deserve what you have. You don't deserve anything. Everyone knows it.
No. Ooh, who the fuck is that?
I'm you. The darkest parts of you. The manifestation of your inner demons. What are you doing here? You, said you wanted to have a conversation about imposter syndrome? Oh, right. Okay, carry on. Hold on. Let me check my notes here. Yeah, okay. You suck? I'll take it from here. At its most basic level, imposter syndrome is the fear of being exposed as a fraud. Whatever accomplishments you've achieved in your life are irrelevant because you don't deserve to be at the level that you're at in the first place. Because as your brain will be only so happy to tell you. So that's a lot. But the good news is it's a fairly common feeling. According to a 2018 Time.com article, about 70% of people will experience imposter syndrome. I think it's worth noting that while the article seems to suggest that men and women experience imposter syndrome at equal levels, further research seems to suggest that women, people of color, and queer people tend to experience imposter syndrome significantly more frequently and harder than their cis straight white male peers. And when you think about it, that kind of makes sense. A few weeks ago, I ended up watching the Netflix documentary Disclosure, which, yes, I am aware I am extremely late to the party on. But as a trans woman, I figured I had a pretty good handle on the topic of trans representation in media, such as it is. Actually, there was a lot I knew and a few things I hadn't really considered, but overall, it was brilliant and insightful. And as I expected and feared, it was hard to watch in some spots. Between showcasing the many instances of people being so disgusted with trans women to the point of vomiting, to the scenes that I clearly blocked from my memory from Boys Don't Cry, it was rough. I bring this up because the documentary got me thinking about the importance of visibility. I remember very distinctly someone in the documentary quoting children's rights activist Marian Wright Edelman, who said, "You can't be what you can't see." And that struck me in a very visceral way. The crux of the documentary detailed the power of visibility to either help or do harm to any given community. See, whether or not we like to recognize it, media has the power to shape how we see others and, for that matter, how we see ourselves. And that representation and visibility makes a difference in people's lives. When you portray a trans woman as a mentally ill killer, as in Silence of the Lambs, or as a liar in pretty much every other depiction of trans women ever, it paints a picture to the world and, for that matter, to ourselves of who we are that's inaccurate and dangerous. That all has a lasting effect. When what you commonly see in media is people like you getting killed, and more often than not, blamed for their own murder, that has a lasting impact on you. And that sort of becomes the narrative that you see for yourself. As hard as this is to admit or even really think about, for a long time after I came out as a teenager, I was pretty convinced that I wouldn't live past the age of 40, because far too much of what I saw in media at the time, especially trans people, pretty much told me that's what I had to look forward to. But here's the thing, visibility can be positive and it can do amazing things. We know this. For as much as Will and Grace's original run was questionable at times, it did actually do an amazing job of making gay men palatable to middle America, admittedly by largely desexualizing them into sassy Ken dolls so that straight men would not be intimidated by them. But the point still stands. It's hard to argue that that visibility wasn't impactful because it introduced queer people to a much larger audience. As much as RuPaul may be a complicated figure who allegedly may be allowing fracking on land that he and his husband own, and still, for reasons that are inexplicable to literally everyone, won't allow drag kings or bio queens onto their show, and seem to be under the impression that estrogen is equivalent to taking steroids at the Olympics, clearly proving that they do not understand how estrogen actually works. It's hard to ignore that RuPaul's Drag Race as a show has opened up conversations for gender non-conforming people across the world, conversations that we otherwise maybe wouldn't have had. Hell, I don't even think I would have realized I was trans in part without the show. When the world gets to see unapologetically queer characters, that makes a difference. It matters because it says we're here, we always have been, and we always will. That visibility is powerful, and it can and does change lives. And that problem with visibility is exactly why women, especially women of color and queer people, struggle the most with imposter syndrome. It's an odd dichotomy where we're not expected to achieve power, but when we do, we're ultimately held to a higher standard than our peers. I remember back when I became a supervisor at my old job, I was reprimanded on more than one occasion for coming off as mean to members of my team. It didn't matter that I had gone out of my way to choose my words delicately and even put smiling emojis so people would know that I wasn't angry. Someone on my team had decided that I was being mean or rude in my communication, and therefore that's what I was classified as. I was expected to always be nice but not condescending, mothering but not overbearing. We're constantly expected to downplay our accomplishments to the point where we start to doubt whether or not any of our accomplishments are valid to begin with. All of this leads to a tendency where we as women tend to apologize for literally everything, including over-apologizing. And it leads to this spiral where we begin to question our success and whether or not we deserve the success, and we apologize for our success, and it's just over and over and over. No matter what the achievement is, its validity is questioned in our own minds almost immediately, especially if you dare to ask for help or, God forbid, weren't perfect at doing it immediately. This is what I like to think of as career imposter syndrome. There are 3 distinct types of imposter syndrome that I've come to recognize. The first of which is career/academic imposter syndrome. The second is generational, and the third is identity. There's an interesting trend that I have come to notice with people in my generation where we don't quite feel adult enough. And I think that's because when you think about like our parents' generation or even generations before that, there were certain expectations of what it meant to be an adult, how one knows one is an adult. For example, I'm 29, and at the age I am now, my mother had been married for 5 years and had a 3-year-old, which is frankly a horrifying thought to me. Like, I couldn't even handle the prospect of having a toddler right now, let alone being married as long as she was. For a lot of the people in my mother's generation, being an adult meant living on your own, buying a house, starting a family, which for my generation really feels like kind of an impossibility, especially living on your own and buying a house. Like these days, really? In this economy? I can't really say if a lot of people in my generation want kids necessarily, but it does seem like most of the people I know aren't necessarily into the idea of having kids, and a lot of us are kind of expecting to get married at least after 30, if not by our 40s. So the typical expectations of what it means to be an adult, especially in your 20s, really hasn't hit us yet. For us, being an adult is having to pay taxes and make your own doctor's appointments. The third type of imposter syndrome is identity-based, in this case LGBTQIA. Now there are others based on other factors of identity, which I don't feel like I'm the best person to quite get into. In particular, identity imposter syndrome is unique and wholly separate from both academic and generational imposter syndrome. They can all be interrelated, but more often than not, it's sort of a completely different idea. For us especially, we're made to feel as though we're not queer enough based on arbitrary standards that are partly due to media and partly due to factors in our own community. For as many strides as I think we've made as a community in terms of visibility, it's hard to ignore that some visibility is more commonly seen than others. For example, as a fat queer person, I'm less likely to be seen than someone who is skinny and queer. If you're a queer person who is a queer person of color, if you're butch, if you're disabled, if you don't look conventionally attractive, you may not be as visible as, say, someone else, especially a white cis gay man. And this lack of visibility leads to people having trouble identifying themselves. As my friend Haley pointed out in our makeup video from a few months ago, she had trouble identifying her own butchness because of arbitrary standards of what it meant and what butch visibility looked look like. Frankly, after I came out as trans, I spent a great deal of time feeling not trans enough because my experience and my narrative didn't fit with the sort of presupposed trans narrative of what was expected that trans people went through. Going into the coming out process, I was prepared to lose literally everyone in my life. But much to my surprise, I really didn't lose anyone. My friends all supported me, my mother supported me, hell, even my homophobic, misogynistic father supported me, to the surprise of literally everyone. Sure, there were some people who didn't get it, and to this day who still don't, and that's whatever, they're not part of my lives anymore. But for the most part, the people who really mattered to me got it. And unfortunately, that feeling of not being queer enough or the right type of queer to deserve visibility is often amplified by those in our own community. When trans people cut down other trans people for being non-binary, not having dysphoria, that harms the entire trans community. When white cis gays shut out or completely silence trans people, especially trans women of color, that harms the entire community and further fuels the struggle of imposter syndrome. Okay, so we know basically why imposter syndrome is what it is, or at least we have a fairly educated guess. But I think the question still remains, what does it actually look like, and what, if anything, can we do about it? Because not surprisingly, imposter syndrome is not as simple as just self-doubt. According to the aforementioned Time article from 2018, imposter syndrome often presents itself in a myriad of ways, including but not limited to wanting to be perfect at something the first time you do it and every time you do it, needing to be the expert on something before you even try to do it, being a perfectionist, being afraid to ask for help, pushing yourself to work harder than others to prove your worthiness, and insisting that you have to do everything by yourself. So that hits close to home because I've dealt with all of these struggles. I tend to have a major problem when I don't feel like I'm immediately good at something, and it makes me want to shut down from ever doing it. That's why it took me years to learn how to knit properly, and why to this day, I still don't have a driver's license. Frankly, I loathe asking for help for pretty much anything. As an aside, I feel like that's partly due to the fact that when I was in grade school, I went to a private school. I was often made to feel kind of stupid if I ever had questions about something, especially when it came to a certain math teacher I had in the 7th grade. To this day, I still struggle with math. And what's more is I never feel as though I'm doing enough to be worthy of my ambitions because, hustle and grind culture has convinced us that if we're not constantly working on our goals, then what the hell are we doing with our lives? And don't even get me started about trying to delegate my tasks to anyone else, because I have to be able to do them all myself, otherwise what the hell is the point? Frankly, even admitting all of this is questionable. Vulnerability is not really my strong suit. For as much as people talk about the power of vulnerability, I have to be honest, it just makes me want to retch. So why do it at all? Well, vulnerability makes for very good content, but besides that, I have this wild and inexplicable notion that I am meant to change the world, and in order to do that, a certain level of vulnerability is required so that people can see you and therefore relate to you. Ugh. Despite all of that, I kind of can't help but wonder, why I am the way that I am. Why is this something that I deal with? I know why is a bad question to ask, but at some point it has to be on a deeper level than just my deep-seated childhood desire to prove my father wrong and earn his love after all these years, right? It has to be deeper than that. It doesn't help that as much as people like to say don't compare your journey to other people's, there are certain journeys that seem to be held up as the gold standard of what hard work looks like, and that's where you're expected to be at. It doesn't matter that I have a full-time job, or that I'm trying to run 2 channels and come up with content for 2 channels, or run 2 podcasts, or somehow write a novel while I'm writing scripts and doing everything else that I have to balance in a single day, because tons of people are doing that, and they have children, and they have another full-time job and everything else that they're dealing with. So if you're really as good as you say you are, you should be able to just balance everything, right? I mean, as Instagram likes to remind us, we have as much time in the day as Beyonce does, so why aren't you where Beyonce is exactly? It's no fun watching you tear yourself down. I mean, why am I even here?
Ugh, fuck off, would you?
Ugh. Okay, so I've taken some time and I realized I still want to discuss what we do about all of this. So look, when I started writing this, I wanted to do a bit of research to give myself a general idea of what imposter syndrome was and what, if anything, you could do about it. And I even found a few articles that had advice, including one from Psychology Today, but I'll be honest, the advice that it gives was questionable to me. Far be it for me to pretend to be some kind of expert, but I think honestly, sometimes the best advice is like, just see a therapist. I know that's kind of a big ask and can be something of an expensive ask, but take it from somebody who has seen a therapist, and at the time that they were seeing a therapist, needed a payment plan. A lot of therapists will work with you. If you just Google, I know there's a lot of information, especially right now with like online stuff, text therapists. Being able to talk to someone can be really, really helpful. Someone who is outside of you and who understands the situation outside of what you know about yourself. Because to be honest, the advice that Psychology Today gave was like, recognize your expertise and change your way of thinking, which like feels a little trite if you ask me. Not saying that it can't work, I'm just saying you can do better. And look, sometimes even talking to your friends can be helpful. A third party who isn't as deep into it as you are. Goddess knows I probably wouldn't have recognized my own accomplishments if I hadn't talked to my friends about it on the podcast and realized, wow, I actually have done a lot of things. And yeah, okay, sure, maybe I'm not where I expected to be at almost 30. Maybe I'm not even where I would want to be at almost 30. But I think at this point, I've reached a point where I'm okay with where I'm at. Sure, I'm not gonna stop trying to do what I want and I'm gonna keep going for my aspirations, but for right now, I think I can be okay with just where things are at. I've accomplished a lot and that's not always easy for me to admit. If 2020 has taught me anything, it's that sometimes our plans get derailed and you have to learn to slow down and just accept where you are in the moment. There's always room to grow and change and get better, but for right now, maybe you can just accept the way things are. It's not as if you can change them.
I'm sorry, that's it?
I'm sorry? No uplifting ending? No rallying cry about how we need more positive depictions about women and queer people of color in Hollywood? You said it yourself, it's not as if they're listening.
So when has that ever stopped you?
Are you saying you want to hear me talk more?
Ugh. God, no. I just think you were a little quick to give up is all.
I don't have all the answers. I agree that we need better representation and that would go a long way to improve things, but I think it's a complicated issue with no easy answers. Like even now, I struggle with perfectionism and wanting to rewrite things and make them better and better and better and better. I mean, even this conversation, I could rewrite it into oblivion and I still probably wouldn't be entirely happy with it.
Do what?
Nothing. Look, the point is, a lot of people deal with this issue. I'm not an expert, I just have to remind myself constantly of what I've actually achieved. Sometimes it's not really about being proud of your accomplishments so much as it is just acknowledging that you've made accomplishments in the first place. You know, I wrote 144,000 words within the first 3 months of this year, but all I can think about is the fact that from March to September, I wrote absolutely nothing. Doesn't matter that I wrote 144,000 words in the first 3 months of the year, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, or the fact that maybe the pandemic was part of the reason that I didn't write anything after that, or it's the fact that sometimes during the spring and summer, I don't tend to write as much as I do in the fall and winter. The fact that I haven't written anything from March to September means nothing I did matters. I think at this point, learning to be kinder to myself and learning that I am in fact one person and can only do so much is certainly something. As much as we like to say that we have the same 24 hours in a day as Beyonce, you also have to think that she has a lot more people on her team than maybe you or I do. She's not writing those songs alone. There are a lot of people who work on her songs with her. There's producers, there's songwriters, there's backup vocalists, there's a lot of different people that go into making a Beyonce album what it is, and that's not a bad thing, but it's something I think we all need to remember, that a lot of these people who are super successful, they're not exactly doing this completely alone. There are people who work with them. And I think the other thing that I have to remember is that at the end of the day, if Beyonce is proof of anything, it's that collaborative work is often better work. If I can learn to find a way to delegate what I need to other people and not do everything myself, my work will be better for it. I mean, hell, these videos are better because you're a part of them. Thank you! Even if you are a sad, sarcastic bitch.
Thanks.
The point is, I know it's trite, but I think it's okay not to be okay. I think that's something we need to hear sometimes, because if we can't get down the basics of self-love, how the hell are we ever gonna handle the big stuff?